Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome to the first ever episode of the Ideas That Go to Work podcast. I'm really excited about this project, and I want to give you a little bit of background information to help you to understand why this project is so important to me. See, I'm originally from Louisiana, and I grew up in a blue-collar family on the Gulf Coast. So by blue-collar family, what I mean is my dad was a welder out at the refineries and then later worked himself into quality assurance roles, but everything that has to do with industrial services and construction. Not only was my dad a blue-collar worker, but the people surrounding me were also blue-collar workers. So my friends, their family, their fathers, their mothers, they probably worked out at the refineries too, or in some refinery adjacent role. Even the people who didn't work out at the refineries probably weren't college educated. So one of my biggest influences was a postman who lived next door. The only people that we really knew who had gone to college were our teachers, and for the most part, they had probably gone to the local school, right? So that's the context in which I grew up, and that's the context in which I was formed. And I came to respect that blue-collar mentality, practical, down-to-earth, real kind of wisdom in the face of real problems. People who could fix things with their hands, people who could figure out how to overcome kind of the everyday problems that people run into. But I was desperate to get out of the blue-collar mode, and there's two reasons for that. Number one, and probably foremost, is that there were many times in my childhood when I would see my dad or my friends' dads spend time out of work. So they would make good money when they were working, but when the work dried up or when there was a downturn in oil prices or something like that, they'd sit at home and not really that we suffered as kids, but more I'd see how my dad suffered. And I didn't want any part of that. I wanted something that was more stable. The second reason is funnier. I spent one part of one summer actually out at the refineries with my dad. And honestly, when I say one part, I mean 1 week. I spent 1 week of one summer at the refineries with my dad. My job was hole watch, which means literally for 12 hours a day, I sat and watched a hole to make sure that whoever went into that hole came back out and to make sure that no fires started. But I can't tell you how physically draining it was to be wearing Nomex all day, out in the heat, have people welding around you, banging. It was loud. I'd be covered in smut. I would come home and I would barely have the energy to shower and fall into bed and then wake up the next morning at 4 a.m. and go do it again. And my dad did this for 30, 40 years. And everyone I knew, their dad had done it for 30 or 40 years. And it just wasn't tough enough. Could not fathom how they could do that tough a job for that many years. And so I wanted out. And so my path, the way that I thought you could get out of that, was education. And so I really tried hard in school. But even when I pursued my education with a very kind of practical, down-to-earth kind of bent. My goal was to get a good job. It was not really to become an educated person, right? So when I went to college, my dad told me, son, you got to learn finance because if you understand how money works, you'll always have a job. So that's what I did. Majored in finance, majored in business, and I got to tell you, my dad was right. I have never had to endure a layoff. I have always been employed. And honestly, I've had, from a material perspective, a better material existence than my dad ever could have imagined. And so he was right about that. Now, the other thing that my dad did is he would denigrate book learning. that didn't have a practical bent, right? And so we've heard this before. The philosophy major who becomes a barista, or eggheads who sit up in their ivory towers. And my dad and everyone around us had some decidedly negative stereotypes about those types of people and that type of education. Now, even when I went to work, I'm white collar, administration, management, but most of my roles have still been adjacent to the blue collar fields, especially in the last 15, 20 years, where the companies that I work for, the companies that I'm a part of, have really been in the industrial services space. And so I'm still rubbing elbows with the blue collar crowd that I grew up with. And if anything, my respect for that crowd has increased over time. Because here we have people who know how to get things done in the real world, like I talked about, but actually have a kind of philosophical depth that we sometimes overlook and take for granted or assume that they don't have. Some of the wisest people I know actually work with their hands, are not college educated, have not got all the degrees hanging on the wall. And so these are people who I describe as broadly capable. They're people who can talk to you about what kind of tree is in your front yard, and they can change your motor oil, and they can re-roof the house, and they can talk to you about the local politics and how all of that works, and they can manage their finances well, or they can run businesses. Just broadly capable people who really make the world go round. And I respect those people, and I admire them, and there are many of them that I consider mentors. But at some point, I started to think that, hey, there's a hole in my education. There are great books and great ideas and great conversations that I kind of heard about a little bit in some of my schooling. Maybe I've read about it in a book here or there, but I don't really know it. I've not really been engaged in it. And that started to bother me, that hole. That was a hole that I wanted to fill. So in my 40s, I enrolled in a PhD program, PhD in the humanities, with no intention of getting a job, no thought process that this is ever going to have any sort of utilitarian outcome for me, strictly because I wanted to know the information. And so what that program looked like, it was a great books program. And so if you see behind me, you see that row of black books sitting up here on this shelf. That is a collection that's called the Great Books of the Western World. It's a collection of books that were put together and edited by a guy named Mortimer Adler at the University of Chicago. And it covers a couple of thousands of years of the best thinking, the best writing, the best arguments about foundational ideas. Ideas that humans have wrestled with from the beginning of our time communicating with one another right up to the present day. Adler actually put together a list of those ideas in a book like this. He's got a fancy name for it. It's called a Syntopicon, but really all it is a catalog. And in that catalog, it has a list of a number of great ideas. In fact, 102 of them that Adler has gone in and he has cataloged, and then he has cross-referenced all these works by all these major authors, people you've heard of, people you may have never read, but you know who they are: Aristotle and Plato and Machiavelli and Shakespeare and so on and so forth. All the times that they've treated one of these 102 great ideas and given you cross-references and things like that. And I thought it was a fantastic program. Opened up my eyes to a lot of things, helped me to start thinking in ways that I had never thought before. But it also annoyed me, irritated me quite a bit, and I'll tell you why. Remember I told you that my dad had these stereotypes about eggheads, about people pursuing that type of education. And that bothered me because, I had pretensions. I thought, well, maybe I could be one of those eggheads, and, you might be describing me, Dad. But then I got in my program, and I quickly found out that the stereotypes run both ways. I would be in these classes, philosophy classes, other humanities classes, and talking to people who were very well educated, and very quickly the conversation would devolve into criticism of the vocations, criticism of vocational education, criticism of getting an education for the purpose of getting a job, criticism of work in favor of the life of the mind. And I got annoyed, in part because, hey, all these people who were formative influences on me and who continue to be formative influences on me, that's what they did. And you're somehow saying that they're lesser? But more to the point, it's because I think that neither one of those sides actually have it right. Being human doesn't mean that all you do is work and deal with practical stuff all day, nor does it mean that all you do is deal with the life of the mind. Being human means that you do both. And I actually put this in a paper one time, and what I said in the paper is, Jesus says, man cannot live on bread alone. So think about that statement. Man cannot live on bread alone. So that means that work, the pursuit of money, of material goods, is not enough to sustain you. There's got to be something more, right? And what Jesus is saying is he is the something more, right? But there's got to be something more. But Jesus never says that man can live without bread. It's foundational. It's a part of what we are. Another way to put this is we live and work and breathe in the real, physical, embodied world. We have to deal with that, right? And we are creatures with minds who can think, who can abstract, who can come up with big ideas and big questions and ponder our place in the universe. And we have to deal with that. And in fact, I think the best people are people who think well and work well. More to the point, I think that thinking well helps you to work well. And so, in my mind, it's not the case that the great ideas belong simply in books or in the ivory tower or at the university or in the coffee shop where the professor is arguing with the graduate student. No, these great ideas, they're great because they're things that we all experience and understand. They belong at work. And when you bring these great ideas to work, you work better. So that's the whole premise of this podcast. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the great ideas that are in this book, the great conversations around those ideas, and we're going to ask a question. We're going to say, hey, how does this great conversation about this great idea inform our life in the real world? Inform what we take with us to work? How can it make us better workers? How can thinking well help us to work well? So that's my thesis. My thesis is every single one of these great ideas has an application. It is an application that doesn't have to be hard to understand, and it's something that everybody, a pastor, a professor, a welder, a baker, a clerk at a grocery store, no matter what it is you do in your walk of life, that these ideas are applicable to you and that they're things that are worth knowing about. Okay, so that's my thesis, right? So I get ready to start this project. I'm very excited. I open up the Syntopicon. I go to the first page of the Syntopicon and imagine my dismay when I discover that the very first great idea in the list is angel. I thought I was going to have to quit the program. Because my first thought is, what in the world do angels have to do with the world of work? How do you apply that? I thought I was going to have to quit. But then, I didn't give up right away because, hey, I come from that blue-collar background and we overcome problems. We keep going. And so I started doing the reading. And like I said, Adler gives you a handy outline with cross-references and all these different places where you can read about all of the conversation that has happened around the great ideas. This is his outline of angel right here. So I started doing the reading. And as I began doing the reading, I made a discovery. I said, angel might actually be the best great idea for me to have started with. Because the problems that we are dealing with today, the questions that we have today about a core technology that is changing our world are the exact same questions that the great thinkers have asked when they have thought about angels. So unless you're living under a rock, that technology, you probably guessed, is artificial intelligence. Here we have something that seems to have human-like capabilities and seems to be able to do things that we do. And we've got to ask ourselves, hey, what is this thing? What can it do? What should it do? Where do we deploy it? And how do we relate to it? Well, that's exactly the set of questions that many of the great thinkers dealt with when they thought about angels. Here are these things. They do some things, and they seem to do them better than we do. Where do we fit in? What are they supposed to do versus what we're supposed to do? How does all that work? So, on this first episode, what we're going to do is we're going to ask ourselves, what can the great conversation about angels tell us about artificial intelligence? All right, now before I start, a couple of things, a couple of ground rules for you. First of all, I am not a theologian, and this is not a theology podcast. Okay? If you're expecting me to dive deep into angelology, I'm going to suggest that you go somewhere else. There are lots of great resources, lots of people have done that. That is not what we're doing here. Okay? Second, I don't pretend to be an expert in any of the thinkers that I'm going to talk about here. If you are looking for a full academic treatment of some particular branch of philosophy or some particular thought process within philosophy, this is the wrong place. It's not what I'm doing. Quite frankly, my program didn't teach me how to do that, right? What my program taught me how to do is what we're going to do. It taught me how to enter into the conversation with these thinkers, to interrogate them, and to start asking the same questions that they're asking while figuring out how it applies to what we do day to day. Okay? So if that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. I'm trying to say, how do we take this conversation, these ideas, to work? All right? Make sense? Okay. So one more piece of background information, and then we'll get into the conversation. As I started doing the reading, angels have been talked about forever, right? And even when they weren't called angels, there were things that were like angels that show up all throughout the human record, right? You've got demigods and gods and demons and all sorts of different creatures that have angel-like capabilities, that do angel-like things. And then, of course, in the biblical record, you have these actual beings called angels, and you have a philosophical record where people have dealt with what are angels, okay? And so there's a massive set of texts where you can go and explore what people had to say. For my purposes, I ended up focusing on just a couple, and one of them more than the other, right? So the first one, and I relied on this guy less than the others, is a guy named Augustine, right? Augustine of Hippo. So Augustine was a bishop in northern Africa, okay? And he very famously wrote a book called Confessions, and hey, I think it's great, especially the first half of Confessions. It's a great map of his walk from really paganism to becoming a Christian. And he's a fantastic writer, a great preacher, and lots of insights. I highly recommend, especially the first half of Confessions to you. Second half can get kind of theological on you, but great work. But Augustine also wrote a book called City of God. And in City of God, he deals with angels quite a bit. I'm not going to focus a whole lot on Augustine, though, because really the best treatment for me, for my purposes, was written by a guy named Thomas Aquinas, Saint Thomas Aquinas, okay? Now, Thomas Aquinas, he wrote this massive work called the Summa Theologica. So Thomas Aquinas lived in the 13th century, 1200s, right? And he was a Dominican friar, and the Dominicans are an order of the Catholic Church that are devoted to teaching. So he was a teacher, okay? And that's what he did. He traveled around to different European capitals, and he taught, and he began writing down the things that he was teaching in this massive work of theology called the Summa Theologica. And here's what's great about how Aquinas dealt with things. Aquinas was a very structured thinker, okay? He thought very logically, and he documented his logic. So the Summa Theologica is set up as a series of questions. He would ask the question. He would say, what is this thing? And then what he would do, he would say, here's what people in general say. And then he would list out their arguments. They say this because of, he called them objections. Objection 1, objection 2, objection 3, right? So this is what people say, and this is why they say it. And then he would say, here's what I say. And then he would write out his replies to each of the objections. So I say it's actually like this, and I say it's like this for this reason, and this reason, and this reason. And he does this over and over and over again with hundreds of questions. Okay? So you can really, really follow the way that his mind is working, the way he's working through the argument. So it's great for that purpose. Now, I will tell you, if you pick up Summa Theologica, it's not always the easiest read, and it's not because of the way he structured his work. It's because, remember, it was written in the 1200s, and some of the vocabulary, I'm not going to lie to you, it's tough, right? So I'm not too proud to tell you that when I read Aquinas, I have a dictionary or the internet pulled up, sometimes even ChatGPT, simply so that I can get an explanation of how he was using a word in that context as compared to how we think about the word today, because the vocabulary has changed, right? And so sometimes it's kind of hard to follow. But once you understand what Aquinas is saying, it makes a lot of sense, and he's very logical, okay? So I'm going to lean heavily on Aquinas. Again, I'm not trying to give you the full, robust, here is philosophy according to Thomas Aquinas. It's not what I'm going to do. I will add one more thing. Aquinas was a big fan of Aristotle, so he calls Aristotle the philosopher, and he refers frequently to Aristotle's works. He also refers to other theologians, other kind of first century church fathers. He refers to Augustine quite frequently in his writings. And so he's a man who is steeped in the best learning of his day, right? And he's bringing all that best learning to ask this series of questions. And the series of questions that we're going to focus on are the series of questions that he asked about angels. So, how did Aquinas approach the question of angels, and what can that tell us about how we should approach questions about artificial intelligence? Well, I want to give you an illustration, right? So imagine that you and Thomas Aquinas walked into a workshop, walked into a garage, and when you walked in there, you saw this thing. And it was laying on a bench, and neither of you were very familiar with it. You didn't know what it was, right? And you wanted to figure it out. You wanted to know. You might have heard of it, but you're like, what is that really? So here's what Aquinas would do. Aquinas would look at this, and the first thing he would say is, what is its form? Now, another way of saying that is he would say, what's it made of? Okay? So he'd look at this and he'd say, well, this is metal head, and this is a wooden handle, and it's so long, and this is so heavy, and hey, it's got claws back here. And he would describe the substance. What is this thing made of? What is its form? Okay? And then after he had described its form, he would say, okay, in light of its form, this thing has certain capabilities. There are certain things that it can do, right? So he might say, hey, because this head is kind of heavy, you can hit stuff with it, right? Hey, because this wood is shaped like this, hey, maybe, you can get leverage with this thing. Hey, with these claws, it can grab things, right? So all he's trying to do there is say, based on its form, based on what it's made of, what are the things that it can do? Okay, simple question, right? Not trying to get into what's it supposed to do, what's its function, just saying, what can it do? What are its capabilities? So kind of like if you were looking at an athlete and you described, hey, that guy is 7 feet tall, you might conclude, well, because he's 7 feet tall, he can probably dunk a basketball, right? He probably has that capability. You're not saying that's what he's supposed to do. You're not saying that's what his role is. You're not even saying he does it particularly well. You're just saying that probably somebody that's 7 feet tall can dunk a basketball. Hey, probably something that has this metal head that's heavy can slam into stuff, right? What's it made of? What are its capabilities? Okay. Then Aquinas would say, I know what it's made of. I know what its capabilities are. How does it work? How does it actually do it? So again, let's go back to the hammer. So he said, hey, heavy metal with a handle here or some kind of long thing. I know that it can hit stuff. If I were going to hit something with this, how would I do it? What's the most efficient way for that to happen? And he might experiment, hey, maybe I slam it down like this or swing it like that. And, he would document all this and he would probably figure out eventually, I get a lot of leverage this way. Oh, wow. That's probably the way it works, right? That's what this thing does well. Okay, so now I've got what it is made of. I've got what are its capabilities. And I figured out how it works. Only then, only once Aquinas has gone through those three questions, would he then begin to say, what is its function? What's it supposed to do? And now, when he starts looking at that, Aquinas takes a step back. And he starts looking at context. Starts looking at, well, wait a second. We found this thing on a bench. And next to it on this bench are these pointy little things. And they've got these round heads. Maybe its function is to hit these pointy things on the head. And he might even try it out to see if that worked. Now, in the process, he might try out all kinds of other things, right? He might say, oh, shoot, could I use this as a weapon? Doorstop? Paperweight? Might say all kinds of things like that. Eventually, he would get down to, yeah, it can do all those things, but what it was made for, its function, is to hit these pointy things on the head and drive them into wood. And because of that function, he would then say, so how can this go bad? How can this be used most appropriately? And how can it be used inappropriately? Right? So you see kind of the process that Aquinas follows. He does that exact same process with angels, especially in comparison to humans. And my argument is we can apply that exact same conversation, that exact same process to artificial intelligence. So let's work through it. Okay? So, angels. The very first thing that Aquinas would say is, what are angels made of? What are their forms, right? Now, when we think about human beings, because that's the context in which we are thinking about angels, what do we know about our form? So we know that we have physical bodies, right? We have bone and skin and muscle and tissue and nowadays we know that we have chemicals and electrons flowing through in neurons and blood and all kinds of stuff, right? That is a part of how we're built. In addition, we have some sort of, Aquinas would call it the intellectual substance, right? And what the intellectual substance is, it's not exact, but it's kind of like the soul. The intellectual substance is what allows us to think, and it's what allows us to have will to actually do things in the world of our own volition, right? So we choose to do things, we choose to do them intellectually, and we do them physically, right? We have sense perception. We feel things, we smell things, we touch things, we hear things, right? So what are angels like? Well, Aquinas says, first of all, angels don't have bodies, right? They are not embodied in the same way that human beings are. And he has good source material. The Bible says so, right? The Bible is the source of information about angels, and the Bible says that the angels are spirit beings in the same way that God is a spirit. So they don't have bodies in and of themselves. Now look, this is not to say that we don't sometimes encounter angels in the Bible who are embodied. The difference is that the body is not, that's kind of like putting on a costume for an angel, right? Putting on a disguise, putting on a mask. So I can put on the costume as if I am, the Texas Longhorn, but I am not a Texas Longhorn. So angels could put on the body as if they are human beings, but they don't actually have bodies. They're not actually human beings. It's just a costume, right? So he says, hey, they're not embodied in the same way that human beings are. They are spirit beings. They are, though, intellectual substance in the same way that we are, right? So we have this intellectual substance that lets us understand, lets us think, and this intellectual substance that allows us to choose, to have will, intellect and will. That's something that we have in common with angels and with God, right? God has intellect and will, okay? So the difference between us and angels is that our intellect and will is embodied and has sense perception. Angels' intellect and will is just, that's all there is. Okay, so kind of hard to wrap your head around that, but go with me for a second here, right? They are spirits in the same way that God is a spirit. Okay? So, from there, Aquinas would then go to our next question, which is, in light of the fact that you are embodied intellectual substance, an embodied rational soul is the term that he would use, and in light of the fact that angels are not embodied, but they are intellectual substance, what does that mean about capabilities? Okay? So I'm going to start with humans again, because that's what we understand, right? Among the defining characteristics of humans is that we reason things out, right? We think things through. We don't just understand, without working through it at all. Now, we have aha moments, right? We have moments of insight and clarity, but think about how we get to them. We get to them through the union of our intellectual substance and our physical form. So, what's that mean? We take in sensory input about our world, right? We feel things, we touch things, we see things, we interact with things, and over time we form pictures of what these things are, and then eventually we have an aha moment where we understand what that thing is. Okay? So the best example that I can come up with of this is the way that a child comes to understand a dog, right? So when someone is a child, parent, whatever, you're walking around with your kid, every time you see a dog, you say, oh, look, there's a doggy, right? At some point, the child will come to associate four-legged, furry creatures with doggies. And for a time, everything the child sees that has four legs and is furry is a dog, right? Sees a cat, calls it a dog. Sees a pig, calls it a dog. Sees a horse, calls it a dog. Sees a cow, calls it a dog. It has four legs. It has fur. It's not a human. It's a dog. And then somewhere along the line, as you continue to correct and the child continues to have interactions with different animals, somewhere along the line, the child has an aha moment. When suddenly it clicks and they say, wait, not everything's a dog. Just because it has four legs, I know what a dog is. I understand dog. And what the scientists tell us is then they have this abstract concept, this picture, this form of dog in their head. And now they understand dog. Right? That's how we work. And then we have this will, and that will says we get to choose how we're going to interact with the world, what we're going to do with that knowledge. And then because we're embodied again, we can actually enact that in the world. So we can go touch our physical surroundings and we can manipulate them and move them and change them and be changed by them. Those are our capabilities, right? Angels are a little bit different in their capabilities. They understand, but they must not understand the way we do because they don't have bodies. Right? And they have will, but they must not enact their will in the same way that we do because they don't have bodies. Right? So, Aquinas would say, hey, angels understand and have will in the same way that human beings understand and have will. Okay, so I know that they have that set of capabilities. They're lacking some other capabilities. They're lacking this sensory perception, right? They're lacking this ability to touch and feel and smell and hear. And so now he's going to move to the next question. And he's going to say, okay, so how do angels work? Right? We know how we understand. I just described how we come to understanding, right? We work it out. That's what we do. We are equipped to work it out. And some would argue uniquely equipped to work it out. That no other species, no other part of creation works things out in the same way that we do. That's a topic for another day. Angels must understand in a different way. And so what Aquinas says is, well, shoot, they must understand as a part of their being. They don't work it out. Whatever it is that they are supposed to understand, they just understand because God planted it there. As a part of their creation, when the angels created, God implants their understanding, and so the angel never had to work out what a dog is. The angel just came into being understanding dog. Another way of saying this is, as human beings, we work from the particular, from the actual dog, to the general, a concept of dog. Angels don't have that same experience with the particular, right? They start from the general, understanding the concept of dog. Now, they may interact with particular later in different ways, but they did not come to their understanding in the same way. They started from the general, they go to the particular. We start at the particular, we go to the general. Make sense? We work in different ways, right? And those different ways that we work come from the fact that we have different sets of capabilities, which come from the fact that we're built different. We're made differently. Okay? You see how Aquinas is working here? Right? So now, here's the really important question. The question that's the most fun. He says, well, shoot, we must be built differently and interact with the world differently and come to understanding and enact our will differently because we have different functions, because we have different jobs. Now, look, we could spend hours talking about this. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. But we're not gonna. I'm gonna summarize the position that I think Aquinas takes, the position that I take, and then I encourage you, think about it on your own. You might come up with a different position, right? Now Aquinas, he doesn't deviate from the source material. He's going right back to the Bible. He's going to Augustine and these other thinkers, and he says, hey, look, angels are designed the way they're designed because they have a specific job. They have a specific function, a specific vocation. Angels are ministers. Okay, now here's one of those places where we got to define words, right? When Aquinas says minister, he doesn't mean what we mean. When we say minister, we think about a preacher up in front of a crowd delivering a lecture. It's not what he means, okay? When Aquinas says minister, he really means two things. Ministers do two things in his worldview. Ministers deliver a message, and ministers are guardians. Okay? Deliver a message, guardians. So think about where you encounter angels in the biblical text. We see many, many examples of angels serving as messengers from God. Angels go to Abraham. Angels go to John the Baptist's father. Angels go to Daniel. Angels go to Elijah. Angels everywhere, right? Always heralding God, delivering his message. Okay? So ministers deliver God's messages. And think about it for a second, right? So how are angels uniquely equipped to deliver God's messages? Well, let's go back to the way that they understand. Angels didn't reason their way to that understanding. Their understanding was implanted in them at their creation so that they understand it perfectly. So an angel that's delivering God's message on a particular topic understands God's message perfectly. Who better to serve as your ambassador, to serve as your messenger, than one who knows that message as if it were their own? Second thing that angels do is they serve as guardians. And again, we see that. Daniel talks about how the archangels are fighting over different principalities. We have this concept of guardian angels that Aquinas actually says, hey, yeah, guardian angels are a real thing, right? Now, angels don't guard in the way that sometimes we think that they guard. That's a whole other topic. I encourage you to read about it, right? But angels are a part of that guardian force, okay? And so what is it about angels that give them that capability to serve as guardians? Well, let's go back to the way that they enact their will. They have a perfect understanding of God's message and God's intent, right? And when they are serving as guardians, a part of what they're doing is they are making sure that God's intent is carried out, right? And so they have to have some will. They have to be able to make choices when the bullets are flying and things are live, right? But that will has to be perfectly governed by exactly what the outcomes are that God has ordained. So think about the biblical story of Lot. So God's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot is a resident. Lot is actually found worthy by God to not be destroyed. The angels go to Lot, and the angels, deliver a message. Hey, you got to get out. Sodom and Gomorrah are going to be destroyed. 2, as circumstances change on the ground, the angels change the plan. Hey, Lot, you're going to do this. Wait, no, don't do that. Do this, right? So they're enacting their will with perfect understanding, delivering God's message with perfect understanding. Okay? I would maintain that human beings were created to be stewards, co-regents of creation. Now, there's a lot of biblical texts that would back that up, but I want to ground this in how it is that we're formed. I want to do a very kind of Aquinas type thinking about this, right? So we have the intellectual substance, we understand, and we have will, but we're also embodied, which means that we interact with the particular. I can touch a plant. I can dig a hole. I experience what other people experience, and I feel it, right? A steward is a caretaker. A steward is charged with preserving, transforming creation. Embodied creation. Someone who's going to be charged with that must necessarily be an embodied creature. An embodied creature who can interact in a physical, visceral way with the world around him. Right? So that, see how it follows? Our function follows from our form, which dictates our capabilities, which dictate how we work. Okay? So when do we go bad, right? People go bad when they don't follow their function. Hey, we're supposed to be stewards, right? But sometimes we think we own it. So we stop being stewards, we start acting like owners. Whoop, that's bad. All kind of bad stuff happens, right? How else can we go bad? Well, the way that we understand things, we have to work things out. And what if we don't work them out completely? Or what if when we're working it out, we ignore some of the key sources? That understanding is not implanted in us in the same way that it is in angels, right? And so we can mess things up. We can not understand things the way you're supposed to, which messes up our vocation, which means things go bad. How do angels go bad? Oh, big question, right? Aquinas actually deals with this. I'm not going to get too much into it, but here's the basic point, right? Angels do have will. So they're implanted with perfect understanding, right? But angels get to choose. And now it's kind of just like people. When God extends his grace, he extends his grace so that you choose in the way that he wants you to choose. But God doesn't have to extend his grace. It's grace. He can withhold it. And if he withholds it, we are allowed to choose other than God dictated. All right, how does that make sense? Why? The only thing I can come up with, and I wrestle with this, is God gives us free will. Is it really free if you can't choose? God gives angels free will. Is it really free if he didn't allow them to choose? So they choose to apply their understanding in the wrong way. Right? That's how it can go bad. Okay, so that's the Aquinas overview. That's how he thought about angels and humans. What's that got to do with AI? I think we should ask the exact same questions about AI, right? Let's compare it to angels and to humans. Hey, some people are saying that AI is a god. We're building our own angels. Are we? Well, let's think about it. Let's go back to the way Aquinas would think about it. Let's start with, what is its form? What's it made of? Right? So, at its core, AI is made out of computer parts, wires, got some hard drives, some silicon wafers, right? So it's embodied, but that embodied self doesn't have any sensory perception in any way that we would recognize, right? What else is AI composed of? AI is composed of code. So what is code, really? Code's a set of instructions. It's a set of instructions that tells the physical components what to do, how to interact with one another, right? And, you can get down to the nitty-gritty about those physical components, right? But at its core, it's code that's running on a bunch of silicon wafers and copper wires, and that's what AI is. That's its form. So Aquinas would say, okay, given that that's its form, does it do the same things that angels or humans do? Angels and humans understand. Aquinas would say AI can never understand. And it can never understand because it is not made of intellectual substance. So without intellectual substance, there is no understanding. There is knowledge of a form, right? It knows things, quote unquote, but it doesn't know things, right? It's regurgitating stuff that people know, that angels know, but the AI doesn't know it. In other words, the AI doesn't recognize a dog in the same way that your four-year-old recognizes a dog. The AI never has that click to say, I get it. It's not what happens, right? And that's because of the way it's built. Okay, so AI doesn't understand. AI also doesn't have a will. Again, it gets back to the intellectual substance. The AI can only do what it is told to do. It is an agent of someone else's will, right? And this is important because we throw around terms like intelligence and agency very cavalierly, right? We don't use them in the way, in a very precise way. So we are here defining intelligence in a very precise, narrow way. Intelligence is not knowledge. Intelligence is understanding at the universal level. And agency, in the way that we're defining it, is the ability to choose of your own free will without being told, right? And Aquinas would say, hey, that requires intellectual substance. And AI does not have intellectual substance. Therefore, he would even say, hey, it's not intelligent. We're calling it artificial. We tend to, when we say artificial intelligence, we key in on the word intelligence. And Aquinas would probably say, you really need to key in on the word artificial. It ain't real. It's artificial intelligence. It gives you the appearance of intelligence. Okay? So, it can't do either one of those things, right? The other thing is, because it's not embodied, it doesn't have the capability of touching and feeling and smelling and hearing and all these things that humans do, okay? That's not what it does. So what can it do? It can receive code, well, it is code, right? And it can take in inputs that are encoded, and it can recognize certain patterns. At the end of the day, that's all it is. It's a very fancy algorithm that recognizes patterns, okay? All right, and so now we're moving into, all right, because of the way it's built, here are the things, its capabilities, how does it do them, right? Remember, angels have their understanding implanted at creation. They get it from the moment of birth. We work our way through things, right? Artificial intelligence never understands, but it gets its knowledge by executing a series of commands, and we feed it just a ton of information, right? And what that series of commands says is, when you see this sort of thing associated with that sort of thing, and it's a bunch of mathematical equations, right, that are making all of these connections. Now, I'm not going to say that it can't extrapolate into other connections. It can, right? It can do all of that. I'm really keeping this at Louisiana public education level, right? Fundamentally, that's the way it works, right? So it works wildly different than, in Aquinas' view, than we work or than angels work. It is certainly not a God. It is certainly not just one step below God. It is certainly not human, right? It is something else. Aquinas might say it is an artifact. It's a machine. It's a machine. It's a computational machine. It computes fantastically. But I read something the other day, said, hey, a forklift can deadlift more than any human being, but we never go and try to say that the forklift is human. AI can compute way better than we can, but we never try to claim that it's human, right? Aquinas certainly wouldn't. Now look, there are people who would disagree. If you're a strict materialist and you believe that there is no such thing as this intellectual substance, and that all we are is basically a complicated machine that is sending electrons back and forth, look, if that's what you think, then you've got an argument. that AI is approaching human. What I'm telling you is the great conversation, especially Aquinas, Augustine, others, they would dispute that. They would say, no, that's not the way humanity works. The best thinkers in the history of the world would dispute that that is what humans are, and that AI is even coming close to approaching humanity. They wouldn't buy it, right? Okay, so now we know how it works. So what's its function? And really, that's the core question for us in the work world. That's the core question in our day-to-day interactions with AI. What do we use it for? So first of all, I want to point out, because of what AI is and how it's built and how it's formed, it's what do we use it for? It's a tool. And Aquinas would say, hey, anything that requires intellectual substance, a choice, anything that requires judgment, anything that requires accountability, anything that requires understanding of context, the situation around you, what's going on in the world. Anything that requires you to make that leap from, oh, I've got this heavy thing and I've got this pointy thing, and the two things were in the same place at the same time. That AI is not sufficient for that. It's not built for that. Anything that requires us to make a judgment call, AI can't do it because it doesn't have agency and it doesn't have the ability to understand, right? Those are the ways that we think about and should be thinking about how we use AI in our daily lives. Aquinas would not be a fan of, let's go let AI make a whole bunch of decisions on our behalf. Now, maybe you could code the AI with the decisions that you would make. But even then, that's not the AI making the decision. That's you telling the AI, in this particular set of circumstances, here is the decision I would make, and I want you to make the same one. Right? And even then, because you know how the world works, the AI is going to run into a situation where it's never seen it before, and it's going to, okay, how do I make this decision? And Aquinas would say the AI should never be allowed to, nor is it really capable of saying, I've never seen this before, I'm going to make a decision out of whole cloth. No, it's going to have to come back and consult you, or you're going to have to have given it instructions at some point, things like that, right? So that really should inform the way that we are designing AI in our systems, the way that we are using AI, and look at how all of this flows from the same conversation. So last point on this, how can AI go bad? Well, Aquinas says that angels go bad, people go bad, when they use their capabilities for things that are not in alignment with their function. When angels stop being ministers of God, stop being God's messengers, stop being God's guardians. They start becoming ministers to themselves, maybe, ministers to something else. They've gone bad. People go bad when we stop performing our function, right? We stop being stewards. We stop understanding with the intent of stewarding, being co-regents in creation. AI goes bad when we allow it to do things that are outside of its function, which is dictated by its capabilities, which is dictated by its form. So that's a lot to think about. But it gives you a framework for making decisions around AI. So here's a potential application, right? I'm sitting in front of my screen. I'm a financial analyst. I have a financial model to build. I want to use AI to help me build it. Okay, good. What, if any, guardrails are you going to build around it? I think those guardrails flow from our understanding of what AI is, right? Are there judgment calls that have to be made? I probably don't want the AI to go do that. That's something that I need to do. I need to make those judgment calls. And because I know how AI works, I have to tell it, these are the judgment calls that I'm making that I want you to apply. Right? Should I allow the AI to communicate the story behind those numbers? I'm not saying I can't use the AI to help me, right? Help me craft an email. Great. Make the final call about this is the email I'm sending? Probably not. It's a social context, right? That's not something that the AI, because of its form and its capabilities, is capable of doing. That is a uniquely, discreetly human activity. Probably need to make the last call on that, right? Let's think more globally. Do we allow AI to run our weapon systems? Interesting. Would have to be a lot of guardrails in that. Pros and cons. But those pros and cons should be governed by that conversation. So, what can the great conversation about angels tell us about AI? What the great conversation about angels tells us about AI is it gives us a framework for thinking about how we want to deploy artificial intelligence in our daily lives, in our work lives, in the companies that we serve, and hey, even in our personal lives. In fact, the great conversation about angels is truly a conversation that you can take to work. It's an idea that goes to work. It's one that you can use right now, today. And I'm not saying that you got to work through an hour-long dissertation every single time you think about AI, but it should kind of form your philosophy. Whatever it is that you think the answers to those questions are, and I'm not saying that Aquinas had all the right answers, but he did have all the right questions. Whatever you think the answers to those questions are should inform the way that you think about artificial intelligence in your day-to-day life. All right, so that was a great conversation. And now, look, you are a part of the great conversation. You can disagree with Aquinas. You can disagree with Augustine. Yeah, these are great thinkers, super smart guys, smarter than me, smarter than you. But that's the thing about the great ideas. Every single human in the history of the world has had the opportunity to think about angels, has the opportunity to critique what Aquinas had to say about them, agree or disagree, come up with your reasons for agreeing or disagreeing, and then go apply it in your daily life. That's how an idea goes to work. Thanks for being a part of this first episode. I can't wait to do episode 2.